Saints Row is back after a 7-year break. A proper 2022 series reboot from developer Volition that reinvents the series on several fronts, and I'm overwhelmed. Overwhelmed not because of the game itself. The game is good fun, the expected mix of sandbox chaos and wild story set pieces. Not because of its premise either. Starting with a simple heist mission, you, the boss, and your gang then vie for absolute control of the city of Santo Alesso. District by district, gang by gang, you complete missions, building your fortune, abilities, and empire along the way. Not even the tone of this Saints Row, the crude antics the series is known for, shocks so much this time round. Saints Row 2022 is a less outrageous outfit, it must be said, than previous series entries. Even with these adjustments though, Volition's latest still plays out like a wilder, louder cousin to Grand Theft Auto. One that's still willing to break the fourth wall, to go for movie genre parody like its opening mashup of Starship Troopers and Rio Bravo, and to present its characters as larger than life, in the Fast and the Furious sense, with overblown stunts and acrobatics saving the day. None of this should surprise you if you spent any time with the Saints Row series. Rather, this time it's the technology behind this reboot that raises an eyebrow, especially if you're playing on PS5 or Xbox Series X, because having spent the last week testing the final release, Volition's approach to PS5 and Series X support is quite extraordinary and baffling in equal measure. Check this out. Just jumping to the options menu on each console, we're treated to 5 different graphics modes. That'll be 2 options at 1080p resolution, another 2 modes at 1440p, and one last option there at 4K. And on select modes, the 1440p high quality mode and the 1080p ultra quality mode, you'll notice an extra toggle for ray traced ambient occlusion appears underneath too, just for those two. On the surface, this is amazing stuff. More customization, more flexibility is only a good thing, right? And obviously, I'm more than glad to see RTAO on console after seeing it in the PC preview build. But with so many options though, it's hard to not feel, well, overwhelmed with choice. Today then, I'm focusing on PS5, Xbox Series X and S versions. How do all these modes work on PS5 or Series X? Are there any major performance differences between them? And which is ultimately the recommended way to play? Do comparisons between PS5 and Series X show any difference? And lastly, of course, what of the fate of the Series S version? Let's find out. It hasn't been long since we last saw Saints Row in action, of course. Our PC analysis from a few weeks back focused on an early demo build. Honestly, perhaps too early, given it lacked the optimization to hide its bugs and crashes. Still, that PC build had some real visual highlights, and those stay in place on PS5 and Series X here. The ray-traced ambient occlusion, for one, is a superb extra. RTAO adds more realistic shading for dark interiors without any of the artifacting we'd see in a screen space solution. For reference, here's PS5 with ray traced AO disabled on left versus enabled on the right side. Both sides are on the 1440p high quality setting, where it's possible to toggle on and off on console. More on that later, but note how pockets of shade around the bank are visibly improved. The left side resorts to a regular screen space method, SSAO quite likely, causing shade to appear and disappear at the camera's edge. All of that's fixed with ray tracing. It's consistent, and even outdoors, RTAO improves the general realism of shading beneath cars, though generally it's less impactful in the light of day. Saints Row's lighting and volumetric effects are also a huge highlight. Whether it's the sand whirling behind cars in chases at dusk, or the way smoke billows in front of headlights, the lighting is standout. Oftentimes, these volumetric tricks tend to get a more extreme use during story missions, but it's always welcome. Outside of story missions though, the city sandbox is the focus. Here of course, the game's destruction physics, the AI takes center stage, And it's not always pretty. There's plenty of odd, unexpected physics-related bugs, but in between that, the sheer chaos possible by triggering a shootout in the city centre with all the cars, NPCs, and destructible street-side objects is a sight to behold. Honestly, some of the best fun I've had in Saints Row is in wreaking havoc, in just seeing how the engine reacts. It also helps massively that for PS5, Series X and S, the vehicle count is impressively high. Even using the top 4K resolution setting in example here on PS5 and Series X, there's potential for real carnage. For all the positives in Saints Row's visuals, there are definite issues in its polish at release. That may change with a patch or two, but even from a session on version 1.1.2 on PS5 for example, the latest as of testing, this game has obvious bugs and visual quirks. Okay, so there's a range to how intrusive these issues get, but at the lower end, the NPCs animate, well, oddly, at a low frame rate while at range. Likely this is a deliberate choice from Volition to optimize for detail further away, kind of similar to say how the Souls games halve the enemy frame rates at a distance. Perhaps it makes sense on the last gen PS4 or Xbox One release, but on PS5 and Series X running at 4K here, well, it sticks out like a sore thumb sadly. More glaring though is the finishing moves. The animations on finishing moves are just fine once you get close enough to an enemy to hit triangle, except the collision, the sync up between your model and the enemy's model is often just way off. There's barely any contact and it looks broken most of the times I've used it. Saints Row is absolutely littered with these small moments of oddness. Sometimes it's funny, but other times it just gives the impression we're short of a patch update. Also, on a pure visual level, away from the bugs, some rendering techniques do look a tad dated. The screen space reflections on PS5, Series X and S, for example, stick out for running at a distractingly low setting, below PC's top preset. So any mirror image across lakes, rivers, render at a low resolution, easily distorted by character movement in the foreground. The rest of the world looks beautiful at a distance, but the SSR setting just sadly lacks the accuracy to match up to it. Also glaring, you'll have noticed the state of pop-in in Saints Row. I'd hoped this would have been fixed following the PC preview a few weeks back, but it really hasn't. Especially in the outskirts areas beyond the city, any rapid travel shows heavy pop-in. Shadows visibly fade in meters ahead with an obvious cascade. Check out this motorbike ride. Sadly, no matter which of the 5 modes you use on PS5 or Series X, pop-in for these elements is obvious and does not improve. Okay, so in summary, the volumetrics, destruction physics, and ray tracing features are the highlights, but on the minus side, Saints Row suffers from bugs, poor SSR quality, and too much pop-in on console. But before we get to the usual PS5 versus Series X comparisons, I think the bigger question is how the modes themselves actually work. After all, there are 5 presets here on PS5 and Series X, and factoring in the ray tracing toggle, which appears only on the 1080p Ultra mode and the 1440p high quality mode, that actually gives us 7 permutations in total, which is unusual, nearly unprecedented on console. Imagine my reaction just trying to cover all 7. And to be clear here, the Series S version has no options whatsoever. Series S users get just one way to play out of the box and that's it. A disappointment, but more on that later on. So what do the modes do on the 2 premium machines, and what's the best way to experience Saints Row? To cut to the chase, there's no visual difference between PS5 and Series X in using equivalent modes. The settings are matched, the resolutions are matched in every case. So let's simplify things a little bit. Let's use PS5 as an example, going through each mode in turn, and I'll say 2 things up front. Firstly, in terms of pixel counts, each mode does exactly what it says on the tin. If it says 1080p, 1440p, or 4K on screen, that's exactly what you get. A fixed resolution with no signs of DRS. So for the 4K mode here, for example, even when the game runs at sub 30 frames per second, which is possible, the PS5 sticks to a native 3840 by 2160 anyway. That does sadly mean the engine has little flexibility if there's a scene with heavy GPU load. Which leads us to point number 2. Every mode runs at an unlocked frame rate. There's no 30 FPS cap, not even at 4K, where a cap would have made a lot of sense, as you can see. As it stands, our poor PS5 here has no hope in hell of hitting 60 FPS like this, and it's left entirely unlocked between 30 and 60 FPS, and sometimes under that. So inevitably the trade-off is in your hands. Volition leaves it entirely up to you to make the choice between image quality, settings, and frame rate. Kicking off then with the 1080p options, there are 3 ways to play: 1080p at max FPS, 1080p Ultra with RTAO disabled, and then 1080p Ultra with RTAO enabled. Now, if 60 FPS is your priority, these are probably the modes to look at, especially so if you're like me and don't have a VRR supporting display to help with sub 60 drops. Volition gives a lot of flexibility, even if no option is truly perfect. So no matter which of the 3 you choose, performance drops hit hardest around fast travel, usually around outback terrain, in missions with lots of volumetric effects, and cutscenes too. Mostly all 3 do run well just travelling around the city, but sadly the 1080p Ultra mode with ray tracing enabled still runs between 40 and 60 FPS in big missions, like the canyon chase sequence. It's variable and improved by switching off the ray tracing, of course, which pushes it closer to the 50 to 60 FPS range, but even then, the drops still stick out during fast driving. So honestly, for the best case in frame rate, the 1080p max FPS mode is the extreme pick for the smoothest frame rate. It's a kind of bitter pill to swallow, I think, but the results speak for themselves. Max FPS mode at 1080p essentially drops the geometry LOD settings down, reduces foliage draw, as well as removing the ray traced ambient occlusion, of course. There is a hit to setting quality then, but really it's not as radical as you'd expect in motion. The biggest problem for me at least is just that Saints Row has to render at 1080p in order to get the best results in frame rate. Image quality suffers, but it's a necessary trade-off for a majority 60 FPS experience. Now, big set-piece missions waver between 50 to 60 FPS at rare points, that canyon sequence being the worst of it. You might also see drops once we involve too much physics destruction in the city too. In general though, 1080p max FPS is the tightest 60 FPS lock of all 3. This is the best Saints Row has to offer on console. It's just a shame it comes at such a high cost. Needless to say, the use of DRS, dynamic resolution scaling, would have done wonders here, just to keep the resolution at its highest moment to moment, while targeting the best frame rate. Moving on though, if you do want to boost the image quality, the 1440p options are pretty viable as well. Just expect an according drop in performance, pushing down to the 30 FPS region at worst on the 1440p high quality mode. Again, let's go with a 3-way split here. There's a 1440p high FPS mode, a 1440p high quality mode with no RTAO, and then 1440p high quality with ray tracing enabled. Between them, the performance-focused 1440p high FPS mode does sacrifice geometry and grass detail to the distance to better salvage 60 FPS. Here's a quick comparison, and honestly, it's really not too drastic in isolation. But in terms of performance gains, well, that high FPS mode actually comes highly recommended. For my money, it's the best balance between performance and image quality overall. Drops go down to 50 FPS at worst in that canyon chase, though it's easily cleaned up if you have a VRR display, and the rest of play is typically right at the 60 FPS mark. As for the other 1440p modes, With the two high quality options on right, even with ray tracing off, the frame rate does get too low to enjoy as is. So at that point, the move to 1440p at high quality shows just how useful a 30fps cap might have been. And let's take it to another extreme, the final mode on the list at 4K. This gets you a true native 3840 by 2160, but interestingly, it comes at a cost to other visual settings as well. So check out this 5-way comparison. Shadow quality on the gun in a close-up is dropped to preset just for the 4K mode alone. And meanwhile, world draw, foliage density also gets subtly pruned back. Clearly then, some sacrifice was needed to hit 4K on PS5 here without it dropping under 30fps. Even so, the frame rate is absolutely all over the place, even dropping under 30 during an early cutscene. Of course, it goes without saying it's the best looking mode, and it's the one I've used for all the opening shots to this video for that reason, but my goodness, it's really in need of that 30fps cap. Everything we've seen so far is running on PS5 of course, so let's introduce the Series X now. In fact, let's make it a comparison and frame rate test combined since there's really no visual difference between them. Now, here's where we see something unexpected. Setting our Series X and PS5 to the 1440p high quality mode with RTAO for example, there is a difference in performance even at matching settings. It's kind of like a benchmark. We're getting a consistent margin of 3 to 6 FPS in favour of PS5 here. The margin is at its highest running around dense grassy areas and tends to narrow for the quicker, more CPU dependent driving sections. It's something to bear in mind with the other modes, that there might be a relative advantage on PS5 all the way through, on the current patch at least. That said, I do notice this does not apply in the 4K mode, and in fact, the fortune's reversed there. There's a single frame divide in matched cutscenes, but Series X does see some marginal advantages at points. Saints Row on console then, for all its abundance of modes, and without any 30fps cap, kind of works like a handy benchmark tool for DF testing. But yes, hopefully patches will improve the state of performance on both sides because neither is ideal. For now though, the recommended way to play on Series X and PS5 is that 1440p high FPS mode for the best balance of performance and visuals. Last up is a word on Series S. Interestingly, Series S has no mode options on offer at all. What you see is what you get, though fundamentally it does appear to run closest to the PS5 and Series X's 1080p max frame rate mode. In other words, it's a native 1080p, has no ray traced AO included, and meanwhile draw distances are similar to the max FPS setting as well. The only extra snag here is that, well, shadow quality is worse on Series S, giving lower resolution outlines compared to PS5. And the other unfortunate news is that despite all these cutbacks, Series S still runs typically between 40 to 50 FPS in most areas, and even goes under that in big missions. In fairness, I have seen interior areas run at a full 60 FPS, though this is a rare sight. In summary then, this really is another disappointing turnout for the console, and even using a 1080p display, Series S falls short on visual features and overall frame rate. So that's the summary. Many of Saints Row's issues at launch could be fixed eventually, and in the fullness of time I really hope they are, because there's obviously a great sandbox game to be found beneath its frame rate issues, the pop-in and the bugs I've seen. Now, a 30fps cap would go a long way for those 1440p and 4K options for a start. More crucially though, the 5 modes offered on PS5 and Series X, while adding flexibility to tailor the experience, fundamentally make this a DIY approach to optimizing the game. It essentially offhands responsibility to the end user, and no option is really 100% ideal. The preference then would be for Volition to actually fine-tune Saints Row on console to offer up a definitive 30fps experience, and perhaps another definitive 60fps mode. But right now, on PS5 and Series X, the best balance to my mind is the 1440p high FPS mode, at least if you're okay with drops to 50 FPS. As for Series S, It's a shame to not see much better squeeze from the machine, and the best route forward there might be to cap it at 30 FPS. Hopefully there are more updates to come for Saints Row. For now though, that's everything I've got on the game's exhaustive suite of options. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.